Well, it does feel rather self-centered to be talking about my spiritual journey, but I'll give it my best attempt here. In the very beginning, it was a very conventional sort of middle-class San Antonio Episcopalian experience. I grew up in the Episcopal Church, going to church nearby where I lived. Bob knows all about that stuff, and got my confirmation after a few years, became active in the church choir, did altar boy duties. I always liked snuffing out the candles on the big candles for that duty. Was active in church league sports and a little bit with scouting. So at that point, I would say it was pretty much middle America, white spiritual traditions in the Protestant, liberal Protestant sort of way. And then when I graduated from high school, I was active in the student youth congregation there, and I went to TCU. I wanted to stay in Texas and kind of be close enough to home, although not right at UT, Texas kind of environment. So I chose TCU, which is just associated with the Disciples of Christ, liberal Protestant traditions. And when I was there, I started getting to know folks in the dorm and friends in classes, and a lot of them were involved and active in the student congregation at University Christian Church, right across the street from the campus. So I picked up on that and was engaged in the activities there. The youth pastor, Ralph Stone, and his wife, Jan, were very active in social awareness activities and social justice activities, and it was a good environment for exploring and questioning things. And one summer I was working with, helped out with some drama activities, a program that Ralph did in the African American part of town. This was during some of the more tense kind of racial issues in 1960, I think it was 67, 68. So that felt good. I also had some classes with folks in the religion department of Bright Divinity School. I was finding out about more contemporary theologians and different perspectives on religion, world religions. I started, exploring other traditions rather than the Christian one that I grew up in. So that kind of felt interesting to me as well. But pretty much straight down the road in most elements. I was in ROTC, and in 1969, when I graduated and was commissioned as an officer, I was fortunate to be posted to Europe rather than Vietnam. And so at that point, my wife and I were living in Germany and Stuttgart area, and didn't really connect with any kind of religious practices or spiritual practices at that point. About a week before I was due to get orders to go to Vietnam, because that's what you did when you got your captain's bars, you were sent to Vietnam, they changed the policy in the Pentagon. So I was able to stay in Stuttgart for the full 3 years of my required service, additional years of service. So that might be considered a miracle in some ways, but I just was able to avoid the worst of the situation there. And then when I was able to get finished with my total of 4 years of service, we went back to the United States, traveled around some, spent some time in Mexico just studying language and kind of living in Cuernavaca for a few months. And unfortunately there I got hepatitis and was had to come back to San Antonio where I lived, grew up with my parents, and was able to recover there over the next 5 months. And then we decided to head for the West Coast to see what the San Francisco Bay Area was all about, and packed up and headed out down the road and settled in, found a place in Berkeley, just south of the campus, to live. And I started my educational career as a preschool assistant teacher. Started at the bottom of the bottom, and spent about 7 years working in that arena with children. I found very rewarding. But also in the Bay Area at that time, we were able to see many different spiritual traditions actively on practically every block had a meditation center or a Tibetan Buddhist group or a yoga group, and we started taking yoga classes with some folks there in the Berkeley area. And there was an Indian teacher who was not living in the United States at the time, but his teaching was the kind of focus. So we started taking yoga, eventually teaching yoga, and that was one thread, and learning about the different yoga philosophies and traditions from India. I also saw flyers around town about some courses at this unique graduate school called the California Institute of Asian Studies in San Francisco. And they just kept showing there's a course on this or that element that seemed really fascinating. And since I had been in the military, I was able to get GI Bill funds. Otherwise, we could never afford anything. So we started taking classes in San Francisco in the evening in their graduate program in counseling and psychology. And it was very much a unique kind of program because it was more oriented on the Eastern traditions. It had been started by Titus Chowdhury from India originally, and it was very much more a broad look at world traditions. And so we started getting exposed to not only the yoga traditions that we were studying in our yoga practices, but Tibetan Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism, Taoism, Sufism, some New World, New Age kind of traditions. We had a wonderful few classes from Angeles Arian, who was Basque and was sharing the Basque traditions, which are very unique and very interesting. So that sort of just put my original Christian background into a much broader context of the role that religion has played throughout human existence, as far as we can tell. Rituals and religious traditions have been central to what it is to be in a community. So I got a better understanding of the Christian story and the Christian traditions and practices from that experience over those 3.5 years we were taking classes and studying actively and eventually the yoga teacher moved to Berkeley, and he was a fairly traditional yoga master kind of teacher. So that was a pretty fiery and challenging but interesting experience of what it is to be in relation to that yogic tradition of teacher and disciple. And so we had experiences. We were able to see and visit events with Tibetan leaders of the Tibetan traditions who would come to town, the Buddhist traditions, the yogic traditions. The Bay Area was just a wealth of possibilities to explore spirituality. And so that was fascinating to us. And then we decided when we graduated in 1980 that we would return back to Texas, where both of our families are, and we just felt like it was a good time to make that move, because we knew that it would be difficult to make our way through the Bay Area with all of the competition for counselors and folks like that around. And so we moved back here to Austin. At that point, we were still interested in reading and in sort of spiritual traditions. Did a little bit of yoga teaching when we first got here, but gradually that kind of got set by the wayside. We didn't really feel attracted to the traditional church environment of that's mostly available here in Austin. We did go to the Unitarian Universalist a couple times, but I must confess, I just don't and didn't identify with the church service practices and I guess in some ways the ritual of that in a way that I felt I could connect with as well as I wished. So we sort of went on our own way from 1980 till about actually early 2000s. In 2002, my father died in 1997. My mother died in 2002, or 1990. My mother died in 2002. At that point, it kind of got me thinking again about what's the bigger, larger perspective here. And so I started exploring in ways to get more connected to some kind of spiritual tradition or practice. I had a friend who knew about the Plum Blossom Sangha, which is a Buddhist tradition under Thich Nhat Hanh's guidance. And so I would sit with them on once a week for about a year and a half, I guess. And the meditation and the spacious kind of quality of that, and I really identify with a lot of the Buddhist worldview, their understanding of mind and how our thinking and our assumptions and our ideas affect us and our perceptions of the world. So the Buddhist kind of tradition sort of cuts through a lot of what I think of as in the way between us and our quote unquote realities. About that time in 2003, I also found to another person the Friends Meeting of Austin meeting at the Recreation Center. And so I started coming on Sunday mornings, and that was kind of a real surprise to me. I had sort of vague ideas of what Quakers were like, but what I found was that the openness and the spaciousness and the silence could allow me to bring in all that I had gathered through my experience with Eastern traditions, world traditions, Middle Eastern traditions. And yet there was that sort of Christian orientation as well. It wasn't totally divorced from the Christian tradition. So that sort of thought, well, this is the middle ground. This is the place that can provide me a sense of spiritual connection and community, and the testimonies and the people. Really, I think a lot of it too was just the people that I began to get to know as I came to meeting. Really, I think is what caused me to choose to continue with the Friends meeting of Boston rather than the Plum Blossom Sangha or other options. The idea that there is that God in everyone is a theme that I like. I think my struggle had been just exactly how to formulate the idea of God for many years in my life. And the very practical and social justice oriented and openness of the Friends meeting format just allowed me at that point to say, yeah, this feels like a place I can feel at home. And after probably a couple of years of coming, I finally stood up one meeting, and I was sitting in meeting. I still remember I was sitting on the floor at the back of the recreation center at that time, and I just kept getting these thoughts. And so I actually pulled out a piece of paper I had in my little pocket, and I wrote down what I was thinking. And I thought, man, I had the shakes and the quakes, and I thought, this must be it. So I stood up. I still remember it was a time where there were other visitors from the National Education Committee were visiting, and they had finished their meeting. They were sitting in the meeting. And so I stood up to give my first ministry. I still remember exactly what I said. So I'll share that to sort of set the stage for how I see it now. So the message I got was, if you ask me, how do I understand God? I must answer, I do not. If you ask me, how do I pray? I must answer, I have no idea. If you ask me, what does this mean? I must answer, it is beyond me. If you ask or do not ask, I cannot say. And yet, so at the time I gave it, I didn't have the "and yet" on the end of it. And after I shared it and after I thought about it, I thought, oh, that must come out very bizarre and strange. And I felt horrible. And I called Terry and Liz because I'd made a connection. I said, what have I done? And I said, oh, no, don't worry. Probably nobody remembered anyway. Don't worry about it. But many times I've come back to that, and it still rings true for how I'm dealing with my sense of what's beyond just me and what's beyond just my own perception. And so it kind of taps into my ongoing and many years of interest from college days with mysticism and ways of touching or contacting that which is greater than certainly my awareness and my understanding, and that which is underneath and supporting and nourishing this obvious creative drive in the universe to produce things like us. But things that just didn't quite fit into any of the creeds and any of the disciplines and any of the direct philosophies that I had learned about in growing up directly. And I didn't have some kind of transformative personal experience of divine to go on. So I kind of have found myself more intrigued with that which is beyond understanding. And how do we get at that? How do we make some kind of personal connection of a sort, or at least identification with that. How do we communicate it in our lives? And I guess that's another connection with the Friends meeting that I appreciate, because a lot of what the Friends are about is not the ritual, other than the silence, which is a form of ritual. It's not the creed. It's spirit in action, and sharing a light in practical ways. So that kind of helps me to make headway in that quest for how do I understand the universe in that sense. There'll be a couple other things come to mind. One is I found the series, I think that Joe and some others had done a non-theist study group and forum series years ago, and reading the book Godless for God's Sake was really helpful for me, is seeing that really brief but expansive view of religion and the role religion has played, and the way religion and concepts of God have been representative in various traditions, and in even in the Christian tradition. That again, it puts the very power that religion and spirituality can have into a context that makes it understandable to me, and helps me to see my place in that series. I'm sure there'll be some other things that come up, but I kind of want to make a pause here and see what sparks in other people, what kind of thoughts you may be having about how some of this may or may not have resonated in your own experience. So I'm going to be quiet and see who else wants to share a little bit. You will have to unmute yourself if you want to share.
Tobin, I just had a real quick question for you, because I didn't hear you talk about it. But could you talk a little bit about your commitment to poetry?
Well, it's funny you should ask. I have a couple of poems I figured I'd share at the end, because I appreciate that. I find that things come through. I mean, I don't claim much about how they happen. They just, if I'm sitting thinking about stuff, or even walking late at night, sometimes things come through. And in poetry, I find a way to kind of give the essence, the spark that allows for other connections to be there. Very, very focused, and surprising things happen. I get as much out of the poetry, I think, or more so than anybody else, because it's always a surprise to me. So I appreciate that. I will share a couple towards the end that I think are part of my own development.
Tobin, I have a question as well. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. Oh, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. You talking about your first message, you said that you didn't quite come to a place where you were ready to say and yet to that kind of that dilemma you were wrestling with. And it sounds like you've thought a lot about it since then. I'm curious how you might complete that thought today. But do you still feel an impulse towards the end yet, or are you questioning that impulse? Or I'm just curious how you're framing that for yourself right now.
Well, I think to me, the and yet is the is the indication that the yet is unmentionable, unconveyable, but it's there. I mean, there's something there that is beyond understanding. I don't know how to speak about it. It's larger than I can comprehend, but it's clearly there is something there, and so I'm willing to just be thankful I found the "and yet" later, and I'll leave it at that.
Yeah,
Someone else was speaking.
Oh,
I heard somebody else
wasn't me,
come
so
on
I'll wait.
but go ahead.
I'm looking around.
Terry?
Well, one special kinship that I've always felt with Tobin is that I grew up in a really agnostic, unreligious household, and was exposed early to Hindu and Buddhist thought.
Mm.
And when I came into Quakerism, oddly enough, the Christian part of it, the Christianity in general, seemed to me more foreign than the Asian traditions, you know. And I had to work on feeling at home in that tradition, whereas I don't know, some of the things Tobin talks about, it's sort of like old home week.
Mm-hmm.
I've been thinking lately, I wonder about your reflections on this, because some reading I've been doing is talked about in traditional Christian churches that over the last 10 years or so, that things have gotten pulled in the direction of Pentecostalism and charismatic stuff, and has become increasingly not irrational, but non-rational.
Mm-hmm.
And I reflect that at least us unprogrammed liberal friends have been able to maintain a certain balance. I mean, we have these wacky ideas like God talks to us in meeting, right?
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, I think we're eminently connected to academic discipline and careful thought. And I feel fortunate that we've been able to maintain that equilibrium. Now, I wonder why we have, and other congregations maybe haven't. I thought from the direction that Tobin comes from, maybe he has some thoughts.
Well, thanks, Terry. I happen to feel like some of that is the city where we're living. It's the community that we are part of that helps to keep a balance. When I first came to the meeting and I began to get, you know, first of all, many meetings, I didn't know anybody practically, and it was silent meeting. So when I get up and leave after putting away the chairs, that was about it for some time. But as I got to know other people and who they were and their backgrounds, I realized there were a lot of folks who were associated with university, with other professions, with other activities, teaching, education, etc. So I felt at home there, given that I was doing counseling and teaching at the time. And I think it's who is drawn to the meeting, who stays at the meeting, that has an impact on their worldview.
Hey, Tobin.
Mm-hmm.
Hi. I have a question. I know you're a parent, and I'm just curious if you would be willing to share what kind of intersection your, journey, I guess, spiritual journey had with parenting, and whether you saw as your views changed or your associations changed, or just generally, was it, I guess, that intersection, can you speak to that intersection of your spiritual faith and your parenting and that process?
Yeah, one of the things that I did question from time to time as my daughter Jennifer was growing up, we weren't active in a church. We weren't active in kind of a community, spiritual community of sorts during her time as she was growing up. And I worried in some ways that all of those sort of stories from the Christian tradition that I had by going to church and all those years and absorbing all the ways that you do, that she wouldn't necessarily have that to draw on. But I guess at the time, I just didn't feel like that was an essential element, and we avoided getting connected with the church. So it was just kind of like, well, we'll continue to be who we are and model as best we can the values and ways of being that we can. And we certainly didn't hide from her our background in the sort of Eastern and meditative traditions, but it just wasn't a big issue. And she's now her own parent herself as of this summer. So I'm now at the grandfather stage, and I sort of feel like that will be a journey that she and her husband also have to take in deciding how they want to raise my grandson Adrian. But there is some worry that she wouldn't feel as connected to the sort of American Christian tradition. Although I don't regret it, I guess.
I think related to what you were saying there, you mentioned several teachers along the way, but it seems like to me in observing you that the children are also your teacher. And I wonder how children have brought about your spiritual walk. I know that they benefit from you a great deal, and they seem to be an important teacher to you.
Well, I will give you this one indication. It was an early connection, because when I was in, I guess around 8 or 9, 10 or something, and we'd go to church. Well, when I was old enough, I found out that when the church service started, if I told my mother I wanted to go to the children's room, which was down the hall and away from the church, where they had the babies, they'd bring the babies in, they'd have somebody there to take care of the little ones. I could escape to the room where the little babies were, and I didn't have to sit through that long standing up, sitting down, mouthing all those things again. It was kind of boring. And so I used to hang out with the infants in the infant room sometimes instead of going to the church service. Don't tell anybody, but I did that. And I've always identified with children, the spark, the learning, the energy, the awe, the wonder, the delight, the expressiveness, all the things about children have just been like a magnet to me. And even later, I guess I should think about this, after training in counseling and later in Austin, coming to terms with some alcoholism in my own family with my father and doing recovery work. A friend of mine, Tom Zimmer, and I did some workshops called New Game Plan for Recovery, which brought the games and delight of childhood to those who were adults and stressed out and in recovery or recovering, or people who lived with people who were having substance abuse or addiction issues. So I wrote a book called The New Game Plan for Recovery, and it kind of ties the issue of that childlike energy that we all had and all have to our lives as grown-ups. And so I think children and childlike energy has always been a touchstone. So I appreciate that point.
Tobin, would you consider your poetry a spiritual practice. I don't want to get away from children because I also, have
Yeah.
preschool is the place where I really belong.
Yeah, right.
So, but I really do wonder about, your poetry and whether you describe it as a spiritual practice. Maybe one of many. And what other spiritual practices might you have? So it'd be interesting.
Well, I definitely consider the poetry is kind of like the idea of a channel or it doesn't feel like I'm doing it as much as I'm just kind of polishing up some idea or some insight that comes from somewhere else or from inside somehow. And it does make me feel like a connection to the energy in this universe. So I do appreciate that when it happens, when it works and it just kind of clicks in, it's like, oh, wow, that sense of wonder again. And so that is kind of a practice. Since up until the pandemic, I also have been taking some Tai Chi lessons to try and do the meditative, physical, connected practice. I've gotten away from that, but I'm going to start next week again. I'm sure, maybe. I've been through periods where I meditate daily I think I had a stretch of several years where I was meditating at least 15 to 30 minutes a day. And then kind of got away from that. So it kind of comes and goes. Primarily, I would say the most familiar one is meditation. Back when I was in Berkeley, the teacher we were studying with was a pranayama specialist. That's the breath, the spirit through the breath. And so we had breath exercises. And at one point, I think it's hard for me to believe this, but I would wake up at 4:30 in the morning and do a certain series of inhale, exhale, left, right nostril, hold, and so forth. That would take maybe an hour and a half to get through. So that was a period of time where I was very, very much focused on that and reading and kind of connected with the studies I was doing. It sort of really felt like it was making that real in a practical sense for me. But yeah, so I've done that, but it kind of comes and goes. And the more stressed I am or was at work, the less likely I was to do the things that could lower the stress, which would have been either meditation or whatever. So now I think my practice is making sure I get 6,000 steps a day. And I usually do that just without having other stuff, radios and things going on. So I get to walking a lot in this day and age since the pandemic has kind of closed off other options.
Tobin,
Yes.
I've seen some articles lately about meditation and how it has some really important physical benefits in your cellular makeup, the telomeres and telomere endings lengthening.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so you know about those.
Yeah.
What kind of meditation are they talking about, and how does one get in on that?
Well, it actually is not at all complex. It doesn't have to be complex at all. And essentially, there are certain systems in our body that respond to states of quiet focus or quiet unfocused meditation, because there's kind of a couple of traditions in meditation. And usually there's different ways, whether you just focus on your breathing or you just watch the thoughts go by. Depending on the teaching, there can be multiple ways of meditating.
No, but I understand that there are a lot of different meanings to the word meditate.
Yeah,
right.
And sure. And so for some, it just like for God, there are many different ways people understand it and think about it and pursue it. But it does, back in the 1970s when I was studying in California, they were doing experiments with yoga practitioners, long-term meditators, and beginning the scientific expression of it, exploration of it. And since then, that's just continued. And the Mind Body Institute with the Tibetan Lama, Tibetan tradition has been exploring it scientifically. I would be certainly happy to talk more about that with you.
Oh yeah, I'd
later
love
on,
to.
too. Yeah, we can do that later. But it's certainly clearly connecting the body and the mind. They're integrated, and so we can
Yeah.
approach things from any direction that way.
Thank you. Just holler when you want to talk about it.
Yeah.
So Tobin, I'm thinking of the contrast that you have presented in your spiritual journey. On the one hand, you have this almost magnetic attraction to children, and yet when I observe you, let's say at a senator's office, you're quite cerebral. You're very analytical and organized, and I was looking at your spiritual journey, and I can see it as both an adult process of integration, very much like the hero's journey, for example.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I can see it as the curious, playful exploration of a child. And I was wondering, how do you resolve these apparent conflicts, or is there a conflict in your mind between childlike curiosity and the adult process of integration?
Well, that's an interesting question, and I think probably by just not noticing it as an issue, as a conflict, I think of the child as the epitome of learning, growing, exploring, curiosity. It's the kind of thing that got us to walk, talk, communicate by the time we were maybe two to 3 years of age. That drive is one thing. And then as we grow further with our cognitive development, there is the possibility of maybe making that somewhat more structured and intellectually organized. And I guess that's why I got into teaching and into being in the role of professor at ACC. Even though I don't teach a discipline, I teach about learning, and I teach about how to do that process. So I don't see it as a conflict. I guess I'm glad to know somebody thinks I've organized in some way, because I don't necessarily stay that organized in other ways. But yeah, appreciate it.
I see Erica has a question, and then I don't know how long your poems are going to take, but after Erica's question, you might want to get.
I can share those at the end. We're getting close to it. Yes, Erica.
Yeah. I just wanted to make a comment about that, because I get a daily newsletter from the National Association for the Education of Early Childhood.
Yes, I remember.
And just recently they talked about the playfulness, and the fact that being playful and playing is what opens us up to new ideas. Mm-hmm. And it makes us vulnerable to caring about others. So that's why play is such an important part of, even grown-ups need to play.
Absolutely.
To keep those barriers and those defenses down, so we can connect with others.
Thank you very much for that. And yeah, that brings back a lot of memories to 1970s when I was working in the early childhood area. But I think play is the rejuvenating force, the energizing creative force in the universe, expressed as children and can be expressed as adults in a kind of a higher form of play, which may be very organized and very structured in some ways, but that drive for learning and exploring comes from somewhere. And so I can see those connections myself. I think I consider poetry as a way of playing with ideas, playing with words, playing with concepts and insights. So maybe I should share those ones that I had in mind. a few of them have come. One of the first ones that related to Friends meeting was, and I just realized I'll do this from memory, so I may stumble here and there, but Coming Home in the Light was a poem that I got after sitting for quite some time in the recreation center worship sessions. And it goes this way. Coming home in the light. I retire from the world in order to find it. I sit still to enter into it. I listen in silence to hear its quiet voice. I release my thoughts to experience it directly, open my heart to make room for its fullness, drop past and future to discover it in time. I lose myself to find my way home. Occasionally, I glimpse the front gate. And another one is one that I often use and practically always use when I'm settling into meeting for worship as a way to kind of gather myself as I start. Sitting Still is the name of it. Sitting quietly, eyes closed, I find myself here in this place, in this space, listening, sensing, noticing, and letting go. Sitting still, hands in lap, I find myself here in this body, in this breath. Inhaling deeply, exhaling slowly, relaxing and releasing. Still sitting, I find myself here in these thoughts, in these feelings, imagining, recalling, recognizing, and returning here, now. I release myself into this present moment, into this eternal presence, noticing and letting go, relaxing and releasing, recognizing and returning here, now. Open, aware, listening, still. And the last one is one that came more recently this last summer. I think Emma stimulated my thoughts about it because she said, we got to have some poems for the zine. And I started thinking about sitting in meetings. So this one came through. Sitting into the silence. I sit in silence to reduce the noise and distractions that fill my daily life. I sit in silence to reduce the tension that holds me in its grip. I sit in silence to remove myself from the demands of the external and internal worlds. I also sit to enter into a different place, a different space. The silence I seek is more than the absence of noise, tension, and demands. It is the presence that lies beneath, beyond, and within them. The silence welcomes me when I choose to listen, and sometimes I do. So that's where I am in my spiritual journeying. And I certainly welcome further conversations about it sometime in the future with people.
That would be great. I really love this.
Thank you. Thank you, Tobin.